South Asia. My name is Vinod Mubai, the moderator for today's event. I'm substituting for the original moderator, Jooneed Khan, who is unfortunately indisposed. At the outset, I would like to thank Global Dialogue for hosting and facilitating this seminar. The proceedings will be simultaneously translated into French. So I would also like to thank Isabel, our translator, for undertaking this arduous job. Logistics, we will have a brief 10-minute break between the end of the panel presentations and the start of the discussion or Q&A session to allow our translator to catch a little break. Our event follows the first Kashmir seminar last Sunday, August 23rd, that was addressed by a distinguished panel of scholars and brought out the dire situation in what was the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, whose constitutional status was abruptly terminated by the Indian government on August 5th of last year without any consultation with the people of the state or their political representatives. Many of them were thrown into jail after this date. Since then, the people of the area have been subjected to an even more intense repression than what has been their fate for several decades since the late 1980s. This webinar is designed to further explore the various dimensions of that repression and rule. The continued presence of almost 1 million Indian military and paramilitary troops that has turned the fabled paradise of the Kashmir Valley into a vast open-air prison for its more than 7 million inhabitants. In addition to the abysmal conditions of the civil and human rights of the people, there is another dimension of the situation that will also be addressed in the webinar. This refers to the recent clashes between India and China along their undefined border in eastern Ladakh. This continuing conflict over the last 2 months or so has brought the region into international focus once again after the Indian government's unilateral actions last year. Also, in the longer term, there is another crucial issue concerning the environmental fragility of the region that potentially impacts the lives of millions in South Asia who depend on the rivers that originate or pass through the region. This latter issue was mentioned in the first webinar, so we may only touch on it very briefly here. I would like to say that from a personal perspective, as someone of Kashmiri Pandit ancestry whose forefathers migrated to the Indian plains a long time ago, but whose childhood was spent in frequent extended visits to relatives who had remained in Kashmir, the agony of its people searching for a minimally safe, decent, and dignified life, regardless of religious affiliation, continues to affect me deeply. We have 3 exceptionally qualified panelists who have spent a considerable portion of their lives in researching the history and politics of Kashmir. Our first panelist is Dr. Angana Chatterjee. She is co-chair of the Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights Initiative, Center for Race and Gender, University of California, Berkeley. A cultural anthropologist, she focuses her work on issues of political conflict, majoritarian nationalism, religion in the public sphere, and reparatory justice and cultural survival. In Kashmir, Dr. Chatterjee co-founded the International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice in 2008. Her collaborative work with the Jammu Kashmir Coalition of Civil Society uncovered unknown and mass graves in Kashmir containing almost 3,000 bodies. Her publications include Majoritarian State, How Hindu Nationalism is Changing India, published in 2019, co-edited, Conflicted Democracies and Gendered Violence, The Right to Heal, published 2016, Kashmir, The Case for Freedom, and the report Buried Evidence, Unknown, Unmarked, and Mass Graves in Kashmir, published 2009. In October 2019, she testified at the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs hearing that was focused on Kashmir. Our second panelist is Professor Siddiq Wahid, at present Professor of Central Eurasian and Tibetan History. His current research interest is the relationship between Central Eurasia and South Asia, with a focus on the Himalayan seam that filters and binds the historical, cultural, and political relationships along this multiple and complex borderland. Previously, he has been a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, a fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi, director of the UNESCO Institute of Kashmir Studies at the University of Kashmir, a university vice chancellor. He received his PhD and master's from Harvard University. Professor Wahid has published widely in his fields of study. He hails from Ladakh and lives in Kashmir, where he has been an activist on Kashmir and Tibet for 25 years. Our third panelist is Tapan Kumar Bose, who is a writer and a documentary filmmaker. He is the co-founder of Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy in 1994, the Other Media founder-president of Mahanirvan Calcutta Research Group, and founder-trustee of South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center. He is an active member of Citizens Initiative on Kashmir since 1990. His award-winning documentaries on human rights and democratic issues include An Indian Story on the Blinding of Under-Trial Prisoners in Bihar, The Nexus Between Landlord, Police and Politicians, on the Bhopal gas tragedy, and his films Behind the Barricades, Punjab, as with earlier cited films, was banned and after a long legal struggle shown. His latest film is The Expendable People, 2016, a passionate appeal for justice for the tribal peoples of India. Until recently, he was Secretary General of South Asia Forum for Human Rights, based in Kathmandu and Hong Kong. He built this into a unique public forum in South Asia for regional dialogues, advocacy campaigns, and teaching and research. He has authored several books, States Against Their People, States, Citizens, and Outsiders, and a 5-volume series on human rights and audit of peace process in South Asia. He has co-authored Blood Censored When Kashmiris Became the Enemy and is a regular contributor to journals and news magazines in Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. We now begin our panelists, and our first presentation is by Dr. Angana Chatterjee. Angana.
Thank you so much, Vinod. I am privileged to participate in this conversation following the powerful panel last week and with friends here today. I want to speak briefly to various aspects of events and the situation in Kashmir. And please pardon me if I cannot go into detail because of constraints of time. Kashmiris live in a context akin to collective internment. The conditions of life are in a state of emergency. It is a place of no rights, bound in a chokehold by concertina wire, asphyxiating amid an unending lockdown. Every neighborhood is impaired, and each life is impacted. A complex system of impunity laws is used to enforce militarized governance and extend immunity to one of the largest military forces in the world. The state administration and judicial system have aided this process through accumulated failure to address the abuses effectuated by these laws, which criminalize individuals, protect armed forces personnel from arrest for actions taken during duty, authorize detentions, limit arrests without warrants, permit violations of habeas corpus, allow the designation of individuals as terrorists, and allow or may be used to effect the life imprisonment and the death penalty. Across Kashmiri civil society, where Muslims are in a majority, India is viewed as an occupying power. Unrelenting militaristic and legal hostility to social dissent targets Kashmiri civilians and their allies. The alignment of national security with aggressive majoritarianism in India prohibits reflection on why Kashmiris resist. Such reflection is represented as seditious. Today, I will underscore certain aspects since 1990. Kashmir has been witness since 1990 to mass atrocities. India's state forces have repeatedly carried out extrajudicial executions targeting and killing Kashmiri civilians, predominantly men, for unproven offenses. Extraordinary human rights crimes include enforced disappearances, gendered and sexualized violence, displacement, torture, the death penalty, and the burial of civilians in unknown, unmarked, and mass graves. More than 8,000 have been involuntarily disappeared. Non-governmental sources estimate that between 70,000 and 90,000 people have died. The unknown and unmarked graves are a vital component of the historiographic record in Kashmir. They hold indispensable knowledge of the deliberate and methodical destruction. In December 2009, the International People's Tribunal on Human Rights and Justice in Kashmir, which I was privileged to co-convene with Pervez Imroz, released the report Buried Evidence, documenting 2,700 unknown graves containing more than 2,943 bodies. The graves are material repositories of culture, kin, and community that have been destroyed. The bodies within bear evidence to massified death. The narrative of a mother, as told by her family who I met, who sleepwalks to the unmarked grave of her son, chronicles her attempts to resuscitate his body. The graves attest to what is lost and what is wrong. Counter-memory is resistance. Atta Muhammad, gravedigger and caretaker of unknown graves at Chehal Bemyar in Baramulla district, passed away in 2016. When we last met in 2011, he said, "Living here is entwined with death. The young men in the graves, they knew death even before it took them. Survival in Kashmir means learning to live with death." Between 2011 and 16, allegedly 3,000 additional unmarked graves have been identified by local organizations and require documentation, verification, and corroboration. It is dangerous to speak of the graves or to seek justice. They permit the space of bare life, wherein a life outside the ambit of these graves becomes impossible. Line in the sand. The social and political breakage of Kashmir today has its genesis in history. The unchecked spread of majoritarianism in India through the decades, during which Hindu nationalists were not in elected office, created political and legal contexts whereby the dismantling of Kashmir can now occupy center stage in government. Following the non-consensual induction of Kashmir into India, the Indian Constitution, adopted in 1949, extended special status to Jammu and Kashmir through Article 370. Article 370 underscored Jammu and Kashmir's autonomy, excluding certain specific powers apportioned to the Indian government as defined in the Instrument of Accession. Fundamental to this was the imperative that neither India nor Jammu and Kashmir may alter independently or discontinue Article 370. Evidencing chronic circumvention of the rule of law in Kashmir, shortly after the assumption of the constitution, India's government began to unilaterally modify the principles of 370, expanding the mandate of most Indian laws and institutions to Jammu and Kashmir, extending the will of the Indian Republic to subsume Kashmir's self-governance. Alongside, the Indian state renounced its commitment to establishing a plebiscite, despite promising to do so in domestic and international contexts in the late 1940s and 1950s. Two United Nations Security Council resolutions conveyed the same requirement of India and Pakistan. Kashmiris commenced an armed insurgency in 1989. During this period, local and cross-border militancy received support from Pakistan. A large number of minority Hindu pundits were displaced. By the state's own records, armed militancy linked to foreign groups reportedly abated by 2004 and 6 as a local and non-violent movement ensued. The Hindu rights election in 2014 and re-election last year has profoundly impacted Kashmir. Casteist, racist, and heteronormative, the government led by Narendra Modi incorporates populism, nationalism, authoritarianism, and majoritarianism. Hindu nationalists have weaponized religion to incite the Hindu majority. Kashmiri Muslims and their allies have been repeatedly depicted as enemies of India and as potential agents of terror. Local social movements in Kashmir are routinely met with extreme repression from Indian forces. Between mid-2016 and 18, 1,253 persons were blinded by metal pellets used by state forces. Kashmir's population lives with recurrent psychosocial trauma and a high rate of suicidal behaviors. Individual and collective mourning is truncated, forcing loss and trauma to be internalized. On August 5th, 2019, Kashmir's autonomy was countermanded by the Indian government as it unilaterally nullified Article 370 and revoked Article 35A, bringing Jammu and Kashmir under the direct rule of the central government and normalizing exogenous dominion over Kashmir. Affixed to the Constitution of India under 370, 35A, the Permanent Residence Law, defined Kashmiri rights to land, critical to the locally organized struggle for self-determination. It prohibited those from outside Jammu and Kashmir from purchasing land and establishing permanent residency. Article 35A ensured access to and control over land, fundamental to preserving a people's cultural identity, economic sanctity, and political standing. Implemented without the consent of the governed, the invalidation of 370 destroyed the very constitutional safeguard that would make nullification of 370 against the law, contra legem. It made the subsequent actions of the Indian state possible and sought to place such actions outside the bounds of the law. Following August 5, Kashmir witnessed the reported torture of children, the elderly, and women, sexualized violence, illegal and mass detentions, house arrests of political leaders, curtailment of freedom of speech, movement, and dissent, falsification of social facts by the state, and closure of sacred places. People were afraid to broach the courts lest the extra-legal detention be converted into a formal one. The impact on Kashmir's political economy has been devastating. Between August and December last year, 32 civilians were reportedly killed. In October 2019, the State Human Rights Commission was terminated. By March 2020, with the advent of COVID-19, Indian state forces, repeatedly identified by Kashmiris as perpetrators of abuse against civilians, were given extended responsibilities during the health emergency, expanding their reach over civilian life. Internet services remained restricted and civilians were reportedly denied access to information and from non-state regulated sources. Persons detained, including warrantlessly, were not released. Journalists continued to be denied access and targeted. Health services, already strained, reached a breaking point. Between January and June this year, 32 civilians were reportedly killed. In May, the Indian government removed certain legal barriers to permanent residency in Kashmir, which can potentially reconstitute Kashmir's demographic makeup and render Muslims a majority. This proposed deprivation of the right to land follows the reported and long-standing seizure of land, including private property, by Indian forces in Kashmir. Demographic reconstruction stands to diminish the integrity of Kashmiris as a people. It imperils their right to identity, place, and language. It endangers their claims to internal self-determination and, in turn, claims of external self-determination from alien exploitation and subjugation. The reconstitution of domicile laws will likely induce dangerous effects. It may subdue the appearance of the political conflict in Kashmir by rearranging the facts on the ground while suppressing and dissipating movements for freedom, justice, and accountability. This unmitigated implementation of states of exception, whereby the law is used to suspend a binding contract between peoples, seeks to render absolute India's rule of power in Kashmir. This next moment, the contemporary Indian state manifests majoritarian rule through the politicization of religion and Islamophobia. Kashmiris are apprehensive that the events of the past year could compel another armed uprising in an already volatile region. They fear genocidal intent on the part of the state in cultural and perhaps physical form. Toxic histories born of feudal, colonial, and neo-imperial intersectionalities shape present-day Kashmir. Through the protracted conflict, the experience of massified violence, securitization, mass atrocities, and social and actual death have scarred individual and collective life across generations. The 4 phases of Indian rule in Kashmir have progressively heightened the precarity of life. These conditions render a life of rights impossible. The deployment of brutality and the evisceration of entitlements threaten the erasure of a people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angana. Our next speaker is Siddiq, Professor Siddiq Wahid. And I would just like to briefly remind our next 2 panelists to speak a little bit slower, just to give our translator a chance to do her job. Thank you very much, Siddiq. You have to unmute yourself. Please unmute.
I got it. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Vinod, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. My thanks is not perfunctory, but rather very conscious, because for 2 reasons. One, it's an international audience, and 2, because you're hearing Kashmiri voices as well. This is, odd as it may seem, somewhat unique. Because so far it has been mostly a bilateral dispute, with India and Pakistan playing the key roles, and with us in the state of Jammu and Kashmir having no voice whatsoever. By the time this webinar is over, I hope you'll get a sense for 2 things. One, why a multilateral approach with us at the table to the resolution of the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is important. And 2, why I'm grateful to Global Dialogue for Systemic Change as an apt platform for us, because we do advocate systemic change in the world's state-to-state relations, and where I think we can find space. It was my intention to preface my presentation with a few remarks on the present-day conditions in Kashmir, because I live in Kashmir, and things are happening every day. And I thought, secondly, because to give a sanitized sort of historical and legal approach doesn't seem appropriate given the hardships that much of Kashmir is going through, or all of Kashmir is going through. And another reason I didn't worry too much is because my colleagues on the panel, Angana and Tapan, are going to delve into that in some detail. However, I'd be happy to respond to it during the Q&A session. So let me now plunge into the task of trying to address three things, namely, how is the dispute over J&K state an interstate one or international one? And how is China involved in the dispute, an important factor? Two, why should the dispute concern the global community? And number three, why are some of the systemic changes needed in why are some systemic changes needed in the international relations or interstate relations worldwide? How is the dispute international, and how is China involved? These two questions need to be answered because India's official position is that, believe it or not, that there is no dispute and that it's an internal law and order situation and that India would take care of it. Pakistan, of course, argues for a dispute status for the problem, but often assumes that they're the sole alternative to Kashmir being in India, which is sort of a very far away question. And number two is not necessarily, should not be taken for granted. And also, quite frankly, there is a growing constituency in Kashmir that, and particularly since August 5th, 2019, that is a year ago, that constituency in Kashmir says that we may have outgrown India and Pakistan, the India and Pakistan paradigm when it comes to the dispute over the state of J&K. Our case for this runs as follows: that it has been an interstate or international dispute involving three states from the very start. The three states being India, Pakistan, and I should probably mention, first of all, the state of J&K, which was an independent sovereign state in 1947, after even the 15th of August. The evidence for this internationalization was inaugurated by a 14-month war between India and Pakistan from October 1947 to January 1st, 1949. A ceasefire was declared on that day, with the state divided into two parts, each held by India taking 45% of the territory, Pakistan taking 35% of the territory. With a few adjustments in subsequent wars, that status quo holds even today, with, I should mention, China holding 20% of the territory, but I'll get to that later. That China's role in the dispute has never been acknowledged is something that also needs to be borne in mind. Until very recently, it was forced, ironically, by India's actions on August 5th, a year ago. And I'll get to that again in a moment. The evidence for this internationalization, in broad terms, there have been a total of 5 wars and numerous internationally recognized negotiations over territories in the state of J&K between India, Pakistan, and China. You would think that this is simple deduction, but you'd be surprised at how largely New Delhi, but also Pakistan, sort of seems to turn a blind eye to this situation. One more point should be made. The peoples of the state of J&K have never been invited to the numerous talks and negotiations around their future. Indeed, it would not be inaccurate to say that in this development, New Delhi and Islamabad, either wittingly or unwittingly, have colluded to make the dispute a bilateral one or exclude us, the peoples of J&K state, from it. And I can address this, if there is time, during the Q&A session, because that's a rather sort of longish diversion. It might take a little bit of time. Now, as far as the India and Pakistan involvement in the Kashmir dispute, it's fairly well known, and in fact, it's overplayed. And we've spoken some about how India and Pakistan are involved in Kashmir in different ways. But it has not been acknowledged, and the world has managed to evade how China is involved in the dispute. And I think this is important to bear in mind because of various factors, which I will try a summary of the evidence that exists for this since the 1950s. I should also preface that by saying that, very few people look at a map when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir and the dispute over Jammu and Kashmir. And once you look at a map and see how it is situated in a geopolitical sense, then you immediately get how international this problem is. But let me get to, the various sort of pieces of evidence, shall we say, about how China got involved. In the 1950s, which is soon after China, of course, became the People's Republic of China, as in Communist China, the thing intensified, although, even prior to that, during the nationalist regime, there had been a sort of bolstering of its occupation of Tibet and Xinjiang in the early 19th century in Xinjiang, and in the early 20th century to mid 20th century in its occupation of Tibet. And towards this, in the late 50s, China built a road through the territory of the J&K state. In 1962, because of this road, there was a war between India and China which was a battle fought over something called the Aksai Chin, which is a chunk of territory, again, 20% of the state of J&K, a road which China has built through and occupied and still continues to occupy. In 1963, a portion of the territory of the state of J&K was ceded to China by Pakistan, and prominently mentioning that the territory's possession was to be redefined once the dispute over the state in its entirety was resolved.
Siddiq, could you go
in 2010?
A little bit slower. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. In 2010, which is the last 10 years, China, to once again protect its interests in Xinjiang and Tibet, has initiated several developmental programs in the J&K state. On the Pakistan-administered side of the J&K state, including land and maritime projects tied to its well-known Belt and Road Initiative, and of course also the Silk Maritime Route. Now we come to a year ago, on August 5th, the government of India unilaterally derogated Article 370 of its own constitution, abrogated Article 35A, and dismantled the state of J&K. The very next day, China, on August 6th, China registered its first and very strong protest. In November, the government of India of 2019, the government of India published maps that showed Aksai Chin, disputed but currently occupied by China, as part of India. And several prominent BJP politicians began to make statements about taking back Gilgit and Baltistan on the other side of the line of control, that is, on the Pakistan sort of administered side of the line of control. So, you have that development. As late as, or as late as 2 months ago or 3 months ago, May to June, essentially, May, June, and a little bit of July, China made several aggressive moves against India along the line of actual control, which is in the territory of the state of J&K. And there are several clashes occurred with deaths of several soldiers on both sides, China and India. And the military buildup continues to sort of happen even today, as we speak. So we have a situation, need I say, that is somewhat precarious. Why should the dispute concern the international community? I think it should, because we may be witnessing the beginnings of a new Cold War with South Asia as the theater of its operations. The core alignments in this case being New Delhi and Washington, D.C., Islamabad and Beijing. Number two, India, Pakistan and China are all states with nuclear weapons. Need I say more? And number three, there's a growing India-China rivalry, which would potentially mean disturbing half the world's population when you take all of South Asia and its population, which amounts to almost 2 billion, and China with its 1.3 billion or 1.4 billion, you suddenly have 3.5 billion people who are potentially going to be disturbed. So I think that those are the three key reasons. And finally, let me conclude by saying that what are some of the systemic changes needed in the interstate relations between, in the world as such. And that is, first of all, a return to people's sovereignty, which is why we begin with we the people in all Republican governments. A return to people's sovereignty rather than state sovereignty, which everybody, including Trump in the United States and China, of course, and India over here, and many other much smaller countries, seem to be stressing these days. And I think that that is one systemic change that is needed with Kashmir as a very important symbol or reason as to why that should happen. Two, in practical terms, there needs to be a recognition of the fact that the peoples of the world have become educated and discerning about what has been called the organized hypocrisy of the Westphalian state system. So I think that after 300 years needs to undergo some changes, and that's the thing. And finally, that there must be some sort of an acknowledgement, and I hold no brief for China because one side of my family comes from central Tibet in Lhasa, so I hold no brief for China. But I think that there is a need for China, to be taken seriously in the current world system and not be denied the sort of position that it is holding de facto today in terms of the balance of powers in the world, and that the rhetorical sort of downgrading of China is not helping. I think that we need to engage, because I think a lot is at stake for the free world unless China itself also starts to reform just as much as India. And with that, I conclude. Thank you. I may have gone slightly over time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Siddiq, for a your cogent presentation and for laying out the international dimensions of the dispute that we'll discuss for. Tapan, you are on next. Tapan? Tapan, please unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, first of all, let me present greetings from the world's largest illiberal democracy. We are living under a very, very nationalist and a virtual fascist regime. Well, what's been happening in Kashmir, as both Angana and Siddiq have laid out before us, but it should be seen, actually, in my opinion, as a continuation of the policies of all the government that has been in power in India since independence. India's human rights abuses now have reached new heights of brutality, impunity, and shame. The 2018 and 2019 UN reports on Kashmir provided a window to the world about the scale of India's human rights violations, aided and abated by hundreds of thousands of occupation forces and draconian laws. The UN special rapporteurs have expressed serious concern over human rights situation in India-administered Kashmir. In his third communication to India, since it imposed a lockdown in Kashmir after August 4, 1919, the UN special rapporteurs expressed serious concerns over the human rights conditions in the region. The United Nations demanded that India should conduct an unbiased probe into the atrocities committed against Kashmiris. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which we call AFSPA, is the source of death and destruction in Kashmir since 1990. It was promulgated by then Governor of Kashmir, Mr. Jagmohan, along with other ordinances that implemented Disturbed Areas Act. This law has remained in force in Jammu and Kashmir since 1990. In fact, it is the source of almost every form of abuse of human rights in Kashmir. There are custodial deaths, torture, enforced disappearances, and sexual violence, and hundreds of cases have already been, and all these have been documented. While the government claims that about only 50,000 or so people were killed in Kashmir in the past 3 decades, national and international human rights groups, and some of which with which I have been associated myself, our estimates are that more than 100,000 persons have been killed in Kashmir. However, to hide the truth, the government has directed the police in Jammu and Kashmir not to file first information reports, which is called FIR in India, against security forces or record even accusations of misconduct by security forces in their daily logs. In other words, the government has told the police in J&K, don't take any complaints, don't create any record. The United Nations has repeatedly asked India to repeal the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, saying that it had no role to play in a democracy. This law, in effect, allows the state to override all rights as it suspends the right to life. The law empowers, to quote the law, any magistrate or police officer not below the rank of a sub-inspector or head constable in case of the armed branches of the police to fire upon or exercise or otherwise use force, even to causing death against any person whom the police or the officer is suspicious of indulging in any act which may result in a serious breach of peace and public order, or even to shoot anyone who violates any laws prohibiting the assembly of 5 or more persons, or carrying weapons which might be capable of causing breach of peace. The law officers enjoy total impunity. As the law says, no case or suit or a legal proceeding shall be instituted in a civil court except with the previous sanction of the government against any person in respect of anything done or purporting to have been done in exercise of the powers conferred by sections 4 and 5 of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. In 2008, Jammu and Kashmir administration had told the J&K High Court that between 1990 and 2007, it had requested permission from New Delhi, that means Government of India, to prosecute members of the army or paramilitary forces for killing and other human rights violations in at least 458 cases. Though permission in 270 cases have been given, it is never known what follow-up actions. We don't know what follow-up actions the government has undertaken. Some of the high-profile cases pending before various security agencies, before the court against various security agencies, are still awaiting formal permission. When I was working with the South Asia Forum for Human Rights, we conducted an investigation in the Disappearances in Kashmir, which was published by our organization called Vanished Blood. We documented cases of different disappearances from 1990 to 2010. And we found in 98% cases, the court's attempt to find even what happened was completely frustrated by the security agencies. And in fact, not a single member of the army or the paramilitary forces of the government of India were ever prosecuted in any civil court. The Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which Angana has already referred to in her talk, it provided somewhat a special status to Jammu and Kashmir, was virtually abrogated by a presidential order. And with it, the democratic Indians' colossal betrayal of the 13 million people of the citizen, or millions of its citizens, whom they call their citizens. It also rendered separate constitution of Jammu and Kashmir inoperative and decided to redraw the map of Jammu and Kashmir state. The historics, by dividing it up into two union territories, in reality, the historic state, or what Siddiq referred to as the independent state of Jammu and Kashmir before it merged with India, has been completely annihilated. The Hindu right-wing nationalists are celebrating this move of the government of India. It is the best of times for the RSS and the ruling BJP as they are overjoyed and backpatting each other. The political machismo displayed by the Modi regime that seems to have gone down well with the BJP cadre and his vote bank. The RSS and the BJP Hindu nationalists have always suspected the loyalty of Kashmiri Muslims to the Indian state. In the eyes of the RSS, the Muslim in India is the internal enemy. The taming and the domestication of the Kashmiri Muslim was therefore, an important item, high on the agenda of the RSS in building the Hindu Rashtra. To retain control over Kashmir, the Indian state has saturated the valley with various types of armed forces, from regular army, paramilitary forces like the Border Security Force, the Indo-Tibetan Armed Forces, the police, the Central Reserve Police Force. Kashmir is perhaps the most militarized place in the world today, with more than 500,000 of the armed troops of the Indian state already present there since almost 3 decades. The government of India has given the army a free hand to deal with the situation in Kashmir. The Modi government believes there is no other way to deal with the terrorists. Freed from political oversight, the army today has been going for the kill. The approach is more aggressive and while engaging with insurgents. They believe that the insurgents have to be gunned down, and there are no two ways about it. The lockdown that was imposed in Jammu and Kashmir on August 4 has been continuing in different forms for the last 1 year. This period is marked by unabated military siege, in communication blockade, extrajudicial killings, in fake encounters, and the so-called cordon and search operations, collective punishment for the entire communities and the neighborhood, which may be described as crimes against humanity. It is now the longest internet shutdown ever imposed in any democratic country. In fact, India has intensified its repression in Kashmir, taking advantage of the world's preoccupation with COVID-19 pandemic. India has undertaken steps to engineer demographic change in Jammu and Kashmir with the objective of converting Kashmir's Muslim majority into a minority. For more than 3 decades, Kashmiri Muslims have been targeted as separatists, insurgents, terrorists, and criminals in the political discourse of India, which has legitimized their systematic persecution. Hate speech against Kashmiri Muslim in the garb of concern for national security by political leaders has become standard in Indian society. The long history of Kashmiri people's struggle for self-determination since the 1920s and the fact that it has remained mostly non-violent till the armed resistance movement began in the late 1980s has been completely ignored and obliterated from public memory. Whether it was under the Dogra rulers or under the government of independent India, the response to Kashmiri people's struggle for self-determination has always been violent. India portrays the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination as a fanatical Islamic project, a jihad against India, an image that helps project the Kashmiris as Islamic terrorists. Kashmiris are the indigenous people, and they're the inhabitants of the region. They've been living under colonial occupation, and they have been fighting for their right to self-determination for a long time. Their homeland has been cut up, as Siddiq has pointed out, by 3 governments, and India, China, and Pakistan. the Kashmiris are now being targeted for a demographic transformation. Their homeland, as we know, they have changed the domicile law, and they have started what they call fast track, giving out certificates for domicile to people whom, under the new law, have become eligible. I believe nearly 50,000 such certificates have been issued, and the time frame has also been reduced. So before we know, maybe a few 100,000 people will be already, being given residence certificate or domicile certificate by the government in part today. In other words, what I would like to say is that the outsider groups, mainly Hindu nationalists and members of the Indian National Forces, India's military, will soon become perhaps a substantial number of residents of Jammu and Kashmir. This brings me to in the conclusion, what I want to say is that there's been a reluctance to use the term genocide to describe the events in Jammu and Kashmir. The reluctance is based on arguments that legal definition of genocide perhaps does not fit the situation in Kashmir. However, many Kashmiris and even non-Kashmiri human rights defenders, social activists, and few academics feel that, like Pakistan, Palestine, and the Rohingyas, Kashmiris are victims of a slow-burning genocide. Some Kashmiris compare their situation with that of the Bosnian Muslims, particularly with Srebrenica genocide, where about 25 years ago, where about 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed. Just to conclude, I would just quote from one of the slogans that was very popular in Kashmir until recently. I mean, when people could still come out. I'm quite sure they're saying it even today. It goes like this: "Jis Kashmir ko khoon se sincha, wo Kashmir hamara hai." It means the Kashmir that has been drenched in the blood of ours, it belongs to Kashmiris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tapan, for bringing out still another dimension of this whole situation at present. Now we will have approximately 8 to 10 minute break to allow our translator to catch her breath. She's been translating for almost 45 to 50 minutes now. So it's now 12 exactly. So let's get back at no later than 12:10 to spend the next 25 minutes or so for the question and answer and the discussion session. Thank you very much and see you. Please stay, but get back in about 10 minutes. And meantime, you can always send your questions through the chat, and I will summarize many of them. And then if you want to direct them to a particular panelist, please indicate that, and we'll start the session again in roughly 8 to 9 minutes from now. Thank you. Okay, should we get back, Paolo and Global Dialogue folks? I think we've had our 10-minute break, so we have two questions at the time, and one of them is to Angana, the other is to any panelist who would like to respond. So I will go first with the one for Angana, which the question is, what is the way forward for Kashmiris at this time? Angana, please unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah. Good.
Thank you. First of all, I think point one, it should be up to Kashmiris to define as primary stakeholders what is the way forward. I think Kashmiris need, as an ally, I would say that Kashmiris must be recognized as principal stakeholders in all matters pertaining to Kashmir's present and future, and in the interpretation of its history. I think there should be a few parameters set, and it will require international mediation because of the climate of no trust and the imbalance of power between India and Kashmir. It will require mediation to have an agreement in which certain actions can take place that would allow for the vision of what is next and how to achieve it to come about through consensus within Kashmir. Because it is very difficult when, imagine being in isolation in a prison for decades and without a window in that room, locked up, and suddenly the window is opened and you are asked to speak. It is impossible. There needs to be a period of adjustment. There needs to be a period of acknowledgement of context where the rage and dispossession that has been experienced might be articulated. I think that is exactly what we failed to do after the partition, and we've paid for it. Every state, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the scars that it has left has made going forward impossible. And I think if we are not to repeat it with Kashmir, Kashmiris, again, I want to underscore, must be recognized as principal stakeholders in all matters pertaining to Kashmir's present, future, and the interpretation of history. Just one more minute I wish to take to say that there needs to be an agreement to demilitarize. There needs to be an agreement for the guarantee of non-repetition. There needs to be independent investigations. There needs to be access to Kashmir. There needs to be access of Kashmiris to the world to address human rights crimes, and for Kashmiris to have the space in which to configure what the political solution is that they wish to put forward. Whatever it is, the defining of how does one define self-determination, for example, which Kashmiris have reiterated is what they are seeking, requires that space. And we've witnessed that elsewhere in the world, in states that have attempted solutions. I also feel that, well, maybe I should pause because I don't want this little time. I can come back to this.
Yes,
I will come back to it. Yes.
Yeah, that sums up. The next question is from Pierre in Montreal. And perhaps either Siddiq or Tapan would like to take a crack at it. Pierre would like to hear about people's resistance at this time in Jammu and Kashmir, civil non-armed resistance by students, women, human rights organizations, farmers, etc., parts of civil society. And Pierre also asked about what is the possibility of a new armed struggle breaking out. So, Tapan or Siddiq, you'd like to get started this?
I'd like to attempt it. I think that, and very good questions to begin with. I think that two things need to be understood, is that protests, and especially after August 5th, 2019, which is a democratic right in any kind of a liberal society of any kind, has been criminalized. I mean, I don't know what the status is now, but for about 4 or 5 months, gatherings of people, 4 or more people, were not permitted. Thing. And at any rate, I mean, even if there were less, they could be broken up at any point. And I think that needs to be taken into account when we talk about, what kind of resistance taking place now. And I'm talking about in the past year and increasingly more to the present. The second thing that needs to be understood is that there is a sense of fear and anger that is dominant in Kashmir today. Anger for obvious reasons, but fear about demographic flooding and erasure of culture, history, and everything. And I could cite you example after example of how that is sort of taking place by interference in school education, higher education, and all of it. And I think, besides, of course, civil rights violations of civil rights and so forth throughout. So I think that those are the factors that play into it. Now, as far as the specifically, what kind of non-armed strategies and so forth will come out, I think that the sense, even for, a person who, has not really directly experienced any of the fierce violence that we are subjected to, it took me 6 months to sort of come to terms with what had happened on August 5th and how it had happened, and things, and many things that went along with it, including rights violations and so forth. So I think that we are at that stage. I recently sort of was looking at, what was the time reaction when something sort of that infringed on Kashmiri rights so radically. What was the kind of thing? For example, the first one was in 1953, when all democratic rights were taken away again. And sort of deceit and subterfuge, etc., were played into. So from 53, it took 63 for a really strong reaction to take place. The other one was between 84 and 87, when the elections were rigged. That happened. It took three years there. 87 and 89, it took 2. Anyways, there are several of these infringements on rights in the recent history of Kashmir. And on the average, it took 2.5 years, for us to react. And almost always it was protests that were violent, that were, angry. By violent, I mean, I'm talking about stone throwing, and so forth. Except, of course, in the case of 1990, when a reaction took place after 2.5 years of things. And then, so I think that it's not yet over. And I think that the reactions will come a little bit later, maybe more than the average seems to be 2 years and 5 months or so, when you calculate. So I think I wouldn't want to hazard a guess as to how long that would take. Are there students groups, women's groups, farmers, human rights groups? Human rights groups, there are a lot of. Angana is part of a very, very well-known one, where people are putting together. I think that student groups, one thing that you should know is that since the very start, student unions have never been permitted in Kashmir. They have been permitted in Ladakh, they've been permitted in Jammu, but not in Kashmir. It was amazing. It's amazing that that is the fact. So these organizations have been criminalized for 65, 70 years. So you need to take that into account. Women's groups, yes, there are several social groups, and there's a very prominent one which on disappeared persons and so forth. Is there the possibility of a new armed insurgency? New armed insurgencies have been cropping up every few years over the last 30 years. The most significant significantly different period was between 2004 and 2008 or 9, when things subsided and there was a movement towards civil non-violent protests and things. As I said, these were also criminalized. And so since 2013, they've been picking up again. So you have that situation coming out. Is there a possibility of it? Yes, there is. When you push a people back against the wall, what is the reaction going to be? And things. And finally, the impact of armed insurgency, of a new armed insurgency that would take place. I think that again, to hazard what that would be like, I don't even want to contemplate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Tapan.
If Tapan and have a chance, and then Angana has a few words also in response. Thank you. Tapan.
Look, last time I was in the valley is about 2 years now. I haven't been back there. But I've been in touch and I've been talking to people. The point is, fear is an old Marxist and romanticist, perhaps like many of us. Armed struggle happens when people feel oppressed to the point that they see no other option. It is not something that people take to arms out of fancy. In Kashmir, as I remember from late 80s to until now, the initial armed struggle in 89-90 was indigenous. There is no doubt about it. Subsequent to that, Pakistan and Pakistan's jihadi forces, aided and abetted by the Pakistan state, they hijacked the movement. And unfortunately, by and large, the armed struggle in Kashmir remained more or less under the control of forces from outside the state. But I think things have changed. And I witnessed it personally. And I've talked to some of the younger boys who have taken to guns, and they don't care how many days they will survive. As one fellow told me very clearly in 2018, that I may not survive even 6 months, but my objective is to fight and make it clear to the Indian army that there are young people like us who will kill them. Now, it's bravado, it may say whatever, but the point that I think he was driving home, and that is what needs to be recognized, and which I think propels Palestinians and every other people fighting for their right to self-determination and fighting the oppression of colonial forces. Taking to arms is not a matter of, violence is not an issue of principle. And armed opposition to armed repression is a recognized right of the people or the oppressed. So, I don't want to go into the details and whether it's fair or unfair, is legal, and violence and non-violence. Those are issues to be discussed by social scientists, perhaps. But however, but coming back, I think the movement is not dead. What BJP has done has actually rekindled, and it has gone underground. And you can see the resistance in different forms, even in everyday behavior of the Kashmiri people. I mean, by not, doing what the government is asking them to do, telling them to go right, they're going left. All that is going on. So resistance is there. And armed groups are also coming, and more young Kashmiris are joining the insurgent groups. Unfortunately, the Indian state has saturated the place with so many soldiers and intelligence agencies that they have been very, very effective in identifying and killing. How long it will take, I don't know. But my gut feeling is Kashmiris will not give up.
Okay, thank you so much, Tapan. Now, Angana, in response to this, and then we have one more question before we will wrap up. Thank you. You have to unmute yourself, Angana.
Thank you so much. Sorry again. I wanted to go back to what I had said, and in response to what my colleagues on the panel just reiterated, that to any understanding of movement or going forward will require halting the process that has taken place since August 5th, number one. There can be no going forward while the impunity laws are in force, while prisoners are not released, while detainees, we do not know who they are, while the names of the disappeared that are with the police and the paramilitary and the armed forces, we do not have access to them, while land continues to be occupied. In August 2020, this month, for example, investigation into the 10,500 human rights violations cases by state forces in Kashmir that were being undertaken by the SHRC was halted. There had been no indication of how they will go forward. These are not conditions that allow for movement forward. I would like to also underscore with sadness that the above, which is all the preconditions toward movement, is not possible under the hyper-majoritarian government that we have at the center in New Delhi and across India today, or the kind of grassroots majoritarianism that we are witnessing, without which the cycles of violence only continue. Also, India is not a treaty party to numerous treaties that it must sign and ratify. How can we help promote the issue? I feel listen to Kashmiris, learn, pause, reflect, ask what we can do in solidarity, attempt internationalization at the level of civil society, states, and international institutions. And those from India must commit to unlearning as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angana. We have one final question from Rafiq Khan in LA, Los Angeles, which basically says, ask how can we concerned citizens help the Kashmiri cause? I would like to, it's a general question, and people here, I think in general, it's good to keep abreast of it, and this webinar by Global Dialogue is an attempt to actually bring forward concerned citizens who understand the issues, who understand to understand the problems, and then whatever comes further from there. But if any other panelist would like to address this, we have a 2 or 3 minutes, and then I will wrap up.
Is it all right? Should I sort of try and answer? Go ahead. Thank you for that question. I I would say that there are, of course, many ways, but let me try and sum it up with 3 or 4 things that you can do. Number one is learn about what is going on in Kashmir. I mean, and that is through the news, through friends that you may have here, and so forth. Learn about it as much as possible and listen to the Kashmiri. I think that is not being done enough. In various sort of fora. The other thing is, once you've done that, talk about it. Talk about it amongst yourselves, whether in the school, within the communities, and so forth, and make people aware of it. Next, I think talk to your political representatives, whether you're in the US, the Canada, wherever. I mean, you might be, to talk to your representatives about it, especially in foreign relations committees, human rights committees, and so forth, to alert them to the fact that this is happening in a country that calls itself the world's largest democracy. I mean, that facade has to somehow be torn down, because in a sense, that has been the biggest block for us in order to try to talk about it, because it's seen as, oh, well, maybe, they're exaggerating, or maybe it's just a religious movement that's going on. None of those things, I think. And finally, I mean, if you can, come to Kashmir. I mean, it's not exactly, it's a beautiful place. I mean, I could, biased in that view, but I think, it's still safe to come if you know who you're coming, where you're coming, and try to understand it for yourself, because it's exhausting to try to explain how difficult it is. At many levels, we're all traumatized, and I don't want to use that word to exaggerate things, but I'm very conscious of the fact that sometimes how long will I be able to handle this? Is something, and I've lived here now continuously for about 15 years, 16 years. And it's hard. It's hard to go day by day, and it's hard to describe it. So the best way is to come here and then talk to people. Not Siddiq Wahid, but somebody who, somebody else that you meet on the street, and get their reactions to it, and so forth. So that's at least that's what I've done with many close friends in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddiq. And now, unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So I'd like to wrap up the 2 webinars that we had brought different insights into a situation that at times has seemed to be frozen ever since this unilateral declaration was made by the Indian government a year ago. But it seems to be unfreezing in ways that the government had not anticipated, and they can never anticipate these things unless they are, soothsayers or something like that, because things are happening on the ground and in the area. But what has remained unrelenting is the amount of pain that people especially of the valley, but not only of the valley, of the whole region, the unrelenting pain that has been imposed on them for all these years. It reminds me of I'll recite 2 lines from an Urdu poem by one of our favorite poets, Faiz. It just came to mind. Something he wrote says, "Zindagi kya kisi muflis ki kabah hai, जिसमें हर घड़ी दर्द के पैबंद लगे जाते हैं." What it basically says is that, is life like a beggar's robe on which patches of pain are put on at every moment? And it seems to encapsulate the life of the population of Kashmir in the last several decades. No longer this fabled paradise that we hear of, which Siddiq reminds us is still there if we want to go and see it. But there are a lot of other things that prevent us from enjoying that. So, with that, I would like to thank Global Dialogue again. I would like to thank Isabel for doing a wonderful job, which I'm sure she did as a translator. I would like to extend a very warm thanks to all the panelists who have become friends. Of course, I've known Tapan for a long time, but it's very good to be together with Angana and with Siddiq, and no less Firoz, who I've been together with for many, many decades. And with also, I would like to close on this note and hope that we will have perhaps further seminars or webinars of this as long as we cannot meet in person.
Yeah.
So thank you again very much.
Thank
Just
you.
a note to tell all of you that the first webinar YouTube video has circulated and thousands have viewed it by now. We will circulate the YouTube video of this webinar to all of you very soon, in a couple of days. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye. And thanks to everybody.
Bye. Yes.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Keep well.
Jerome, Adam.